Well, you may be wondering, quite rightly, why we're commencing our launch of the Centre for Christian Living by speaking about another religion, by speaking about Islam. It's because we want to provide Bible-driven thinking, ethical thinking and encouragement for every facet of the Christian life, as I said before. And one aspect of that life that we can't avoid is that every day as we walk out our front doors, we encounter a religiously pluralist culture and society. We bump into and have conversations with Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists, with well-thought-through atheists and agnostics, and of course with a large number of people who are not much of anything at all. And how we speak and interact with these people is of course an important part of our daily Christian life. Our words have the potential, as Proverbs often reminds us, to bring healing and blessing and life to those around us if we choose them carefully. Or of course to sow division, conflict and harm if we don't. Or perhaps to achieve nothing if we keep our mouths shut. But how do we bring healing, life and blessing on the subject of Islam? Because it's a struggle in our current community, is it not? With the very real threat of Islamic terrorism in the West and the reality of a militant Islamic state rising in the Middle East, with a state at war with its neighbours and with Israel. As a society, we seem unsure of how to talk about what is going on and how it relates to Islam. And I don't know about you, but I find myself caught between two rather unpalatable alternatives. On the one hand, I don't want to insult our Muslim neighbours or stir up conflict or sectarian hatreds by blaming Islam or Muslims as a whole for the violent actions of people who act in the name of Islam. It not only feels unfair, it feels unhelpful, but as a Christian, I can understand how that might feel. As a Christian, do you wish to bear the blame for Benny Hinn? Do you wish to bear the blame for the Westboro Baptist Church, for Joel Osteen, for the Protestant Catholic war in Northern Ireland, for the crimes and misdemeanours of pedophile priests? Please don't draw your conclusions about Christianity from the actions of people who act in my name. Please don't decide what I believe and how I think from what they do. We of all people as Christians should understand how unfair and unhelpful that is. And so I don't want to join in a crude chorus of condemnation against Islam, and I'm sure many of you don't either. And on the other hand, however, I'm also sure I'm not alone in feeling that the political leaders and opinion shapers of our society are protesting rather too much when they say that there's nothing remotely Islamic about Islamic State. They boldly assert that the rising tide of terrorism and military action and violence that's committed in the name of Islam is in fact nothing whatsoever to do with Islam, despite the repeated, explicit and quite coherent, as far as I can see, justifications and quotations on the part of the Islamic State militants to justify their actions from the Quran and the example of Muhammad. No, say the leaders of the West, they are just extremists and madmen who are playing on widespread resentment at Western foreign policy and so on. Now, President Obama, as you know, has led the charge on this, but other Western leaders have said exactly the same thing and have been doing so really since 9/11. The repeated insistence that Islam really is in essence a religion of peace and tolerance just has the smell of spin about it to me. Do you feel that way? Especially if you compare that spin with the teachings and practice of Islam for the last 13 centuries. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with two rather unpalatable alternatives, doesn't it? To blame Islam for the militancy and violence committed in its name, that seems unfair and unhelpful. Or not to talk about Islam at all, and to insist that it has absolutely nothing to do with Islam and to leave Islam out of our communal conversation altogether. Well, I want to suggest there is another way. Otherwise, you've wasted your time coming tonight, haven't you? But I want to suggest there is another way, a constructive way that we as Christians can contribute to a conversation about Islam. And I want to suggest that we as Christians actually have a very significant and unique role to play in that conversation for reasons I'll get to soon. But understanding what this different mode of conversation might be and how we might contribute is going to need some rethinking and some hard mental work. And I'm sorry to say, the truth is that there won't be enough time tonight to do all that mental work that we need to do. But we can make a start. And the place we're going to start is by understanding who we're talking with, which is surely the first step in any fruitful conversation. We're going to understand what it means to talk with Islam and with a Muslim, and also what it means to speak with secular humanism. Because if we're going to speak about Islam in our society, we need to understand both of these movements and ideas. It's particularly important to understand secular humanism, because secular humanism is the dominant belief system of our society. It's so dominant, in fact, you probably don't even think about it from day to day. It's rarely even identified in our culture as a belief system, as a worldview. But it's the accepted framework for everything that happens in our society. For every political debate, for every television program, for every current affairs show and every newspaper. It's the underlying, almost universally accepted assumption of our culture. It's in the air we breathe, and it's almost certainly in your brain and in mine as we come to think about this subject. We need to understand secular humanism and be ready to interact with it, because it's the ground rules by which we have this conversation in our society. Now, secular humanism is very different, of course, from Christianity and from Islam. And in its own way, it's just as universalist and totalising as both Christianity and Islam can be. And what I want to do first of all tonight is give you a very quick sketch or tour of secular humanism, a very quick understanding of what it is, and hopefully help you come to terms with and understand what sort of conversation you're going to be having with the people around you. Now, secular humanism, and we could give it lots of other names as well, has an intellectual history going back to the 18th century, to the Enlightenment. It has been brewing and growing slowly since that time over a period of 200, 250 years, and has come to be dominant in the last 100 years or so. It's not fundamentally an atheistic worldview, although many secular humanists are atheists. But all secular humanists, whether they have some belief in God or not, share a basic view that your religious faith is a matter of personal choice and value and opinion, and not something that can be rationally and openly discussed. For secular humanism, religion is always private and personal, not public and objective. And you can see that as you think about talking about religion in the culture today and with your friends. Religion is always a matter of opinion and of value, not of truth. Now, why is this? Why does our culture operate on this assumption? It's because of a decisive change that took place in the way our culture thought about reality and God and the world, a change that took place over the last 200 years. And to try to explain this quite decisive change, I want to take you to an illustration of a house. Let's imagine that all of reality, everything we experience and everything that exists, is a big house with an upstairs and a downstairs. And the way that people have thought about this reality for millennia has been that there is an upstairs where God and values, morals and ideals, the principle of the good and everything that is spiritual lives. There's an upstairs, and then there's a downstairs. There's the everyday world, the world of sense and of materiality and physicality, the world of science and knowledge, the world of rationality, the world of what we might call nature. Now, for most of the world's history, people have assumed that there is a staircase connecting the upstairs and the downstairs. And in the theistic worldview, God created the downstairs. He created everything. And he gave the downstairs its character and its nature from his own character. And he has communicated with the downstairs via the staircase in various ways at different times, to reveal himself to us and to show us what he is like and what we are like. Now, in the Muslim worldview, that staircase, of course, is dominated by the Quran and by Muhammad. In the Christian worldview, the staircase, of course, focuses on the Bible and on Jesus, the ultimate revelation of God's own self and what he has done in the world. But dating from the 18th century or so, the thinkers of the Enlightenment and those that followed them began to doubt whether there really was anyone or anything upstairs. And in particular, they began to doubt whether there was any staircase. In fact, they decided to stop using the staircase and to see if they could work everything out from just what they could see and experience and think through for themselves downstairs. So rather than reality being created and ordered by an eternal God, and reality being a unified field where upstairs and downstairs were connected and made sense and worked together, and where there was communication from God to the world that he has made, within the Enlightenment and secular humanism, the staircase was removed and ignored and shut down. And so in secular humanism, only this world and this age mattered. And that's what the word secular means. And rather than looking to God for answers, we look to humanity for answers. And so humanism. And in secular humanism, we are left with this world, with ourselves, and that is all. Now, this intellectual move, which I want to emphasise, took centuries to unfold and become just the normal, everyday way most people think, had massive consequences. It meant, for example, that morality was not something given to us from outside, from God, but morality was something we just had to figure out downstairs. Morality was something we had to choose and invent for ourselves, perhaps based on statistical research, or based on what we feel, or based on what works. And this view of reality, of upstairs and downstairs, of course, had a massive impact on how people thought about religion and religious belief. Because if there's no staircase, then how on earth does anyone ever get upstairs? There's only one way to get upstairs if there's no rational, objective way up there, and that is to jump. It's only by a leap of faith, only by personal experience and conviction, by a non-rational, non-empirical leap, that anyone can bridge this gap and say anything about the spiritual or the divine. And this means that for secular humanism, which remember is the default view of everyone that we live with and move with every day, all claims or statements or views about anything upstairs have to be a matter of personal belief and conviction, and so belong in the private sphere. To ask whether a religion is right or wrong or true or false for secular humanism just doesn't really make sense, because it's a matter of faith and opinion. If it works for you, it's great. If it doesn't work for me, I don't need to follow it. But there's no solid or testable reference point. There's no staircase by which we might possibly know if a religious claim was true or not. Now, this view is now so completely dominant in our culture, so completely part of the air we breathe, that it's taken for granted in our everyday interactions and in our media and in our communications and in our public square, even among people of nominally religious faith. And this is why most people we bump into from day to day, whether they have some nominal belief or not, will assume that religion is a personal thing, a matter of opinion, a matter of my private faith and values, and not at all something that we could speak about publicly or objectively. This is why religion is also not seen as having any place in our public square. It's a personal, non-provable opinion. How could it be an influence over public policy? Religion has as much relevance in the public square as my sad faith in the mighty St George Illawarra Dragons. It's just a matter of personal opinion and preference. In my case, the right preference, but just personal opinion and preference. And so for secular humanism, religious belief is just a human construct. It's an expression of the human longing for more, for the divine, for meaning and for peace and for the infinite. And so just as human longing and human culture is the same around the world and is variegated, and one is no more superior than another, so no religion can really be superior or greater than any other. They're just different expressions of human longing. It's interesting though, if you think about it, there is one religion that secular humanism does regard as different from all others, not as being superior but as being inferior. Have you noticed that there's one religion that is criticised by secular humanism constantly and virulently? And of course it's Christianity. Now why that might be and how that inconsistency might have risen, perhaps you might want to ask me in question time, but we need to move on quickly now. So we've seen that in secular humanism, religious faith is a non-provable personal opinion or belief. that someone should be free to hold in private, but never to impose on others and to never come into public. And this is the first and primary reason that most secular humanists don't want to speak about religion. They don't want to speak about Islam because they don't wish to speak about any religion. They don't want to have theological or religious discussion break out as to the nature of truth and the teachings and status of a particular belief and how we should respond to that. That's the last thing that a thoroughgoing secular humanist wants. And they're particularly allergic to any discussion that verges onto the question of whether one religion might be right or correct or good or wrong or incorrect or bad. Now this gives secular humanists problems, especially when they come to discuss Islam. Because, like Christianity, Islam not only keeps making truth claims, but to a much greater extent than Christianity, it insists that it is not a matter of private faith. And as we'll see further below, Islam is a very public faith, not a private one. It's a belief system that wants to absorb politics and government within its bounds. So how can we talk with our secular humanist friends about Islam? I'll have some suggestions in just a minute or two. But the first thing we have to do if we want to speak to our secular humanist friends about Islam is understand a bit about Islam, is actually know something of what we're talking about rather than just ignorantly spouting forth opinions. Now you might see on your outlines, if you're following your outlines, that there's a section there, C, the problem of the elephant. That elephant was such a problem that I've left him out completely. You'll have to ask me later what the elephant was and why he was there. What I want to do now is give a very quick sketch, having done a lightning tour of secular humanism. I want to give a quick sketch of the other conversation partner in this discussion, and that of course is Islam. It's necessarily a brief summary, and I no doubt will be inadequate in many ways. And I'll mention some resources and books you can chase up later to find out more. Now, as Christians, we're in a good position to understand Islam. We're in a very good position to understand it. We share some of the basic concepts. There are some shared history and some shared roots. But we also know what it's like to be part of a worldwide movement that's astonishingly diverse, that has multiple streams and factions. We understand the diversity of a big, old movement. And as we come to understand Islam, we need to understand that as well. But before we come to diversity, let's look at 8 beliefs that most Muslims around the world would hold in common. These aren't the only 8 beliefs, but I believe 8 central ones. The first one is that God is one, that there is only one God, the God of Abraham, the God of the prophets, the God of Jesus, and of course the God of the Prophet Muhammad. This one true God is the creator, the all-powerful, transcendent, all-merciful ruler of all. He created humanity, and he put within humanity the capacity to know and to submit to him. But humanity had a problem, and has a problem. It's ignorance and weakness. We fail to follow the will of God that we should know and should submit to. But note that the problem for us as humans is not that we are sinful as such, that we have a sinful nature or that we're inherently bad or have an inherent tendency to sin. The problem is lack of information and lack of will. It's ignorance and weakness, not sinfulness in Islam. And this means that the remedy is guidance, not atonement or forgiveness. Because the issue in Islam is not a sinful heart that needs cleansing or redemption, but a weak and ignorant and heedless heart that needs education, guidance, exhortation and help. And so God, in his great mercy, sends prophets, such as Moses and Isaiah and Jesus, but finally and completely, Muhammad. The complete and final guidance in Islam comes through Muhammad in 2 forms, in 2 linked forms. Firstly, it's in the words that were revealed to him by God, that he memorised and that were written down in what we call the Quran. The Quran is meant to be a copy of a heavenly book that was dictated to Muhammad and that he in turn recited. And the word Quran means recitation or recite. But Muhammad is also the vehicle of the final revelation, by virtue of his life. Muhammad's life is the perfect exemplar of submission to the guidance and will of God, of Allah. And the principles of the Quran are only to be understood and interpreted via an understanding of how Muhammad interpreted and lived them, and how he explained them and exemplified them. And so the hadiths or statements about Muhammad's life, what Muhammad said and what Muhammad did, are just as important an authority for mainstream Islam as the Quran itself. And in fact, without the hadith, without the explanation of how those principles are put into practice in the ideal Muslim life, the whole guidance would not hold together. And so Muhammad is the centre of it and the final and complete revelation of God's will. And to be a Muslim is simply to submit to this, to accept that this guidance is all we need. And by submitting to God's will and to the teaching and example of the Prophet, we come to be a Muslim, a submitter, someone who has accepted this guidance and will of God. And so Islam is not a religion of redemption or of sacrifice or atonement or salvation in any way that we would understand that as Christians. It's a much more legislative religion of God's interaction with us. In his mercy, God tells us how we should live and act in every facet of our lives. And our job is simply to submit to that and to obey it in all spheres. And it does come into every sphere of life, whether personal, social or political. This submission tells me how to dress and what to eat and what not to eat. It directs every facet of my relationships, my commerce, my trade, where I live and how I live. It's not just a personal faith for personal values. These are guidelines and rules and laws that build up a whole picture of what the Muslim life should look like within my family, within my community, and within the whole society. God's will revealed through Muhammad is comprehensive and absolute. It is a law book for the world, not just for a few private lives. And so Islam, as one scholar put it, is a religion constantly in the process of becoming a state. A religion constantly in the process of becoming a state. As Richard Schumacher has written recently, Islam seeks for a nomocracy, that is, for the rule of God's law, not only within my personal life, but within the society and culture that I live in. And this is all for the sake, of course, of human happiness and contentment. This means that the more thoroughgoing and committed a Muslim is in his or her submission to the will of Allah, the more they will long not just for their own lives to be submitted to his will, but for their neighbours and their communities and for the whole society within which they live to be so submitted for their benefit and well-being. Now, this lack of distinction in Islam between public and private, or between church and state, if we can put it that way, obviously represents a problem for the secular humanist. Islam is not content to be a private religion, as secular humanists insist all religions are and should be. Every now and then, when the more radical or strident elements of Islam come crashing into our public sphere very visibly, the secular humanist feels rather lost. They are happy for Muslims to practice their faith privately according to the rules of secular humanism. But what if my faith tells me that I can't do that? What if my faith tells me that every sphere of life, communal, social and political, should come under the rule of Allah? As I've said, as Christians, we tend to think of salvation as being the outcome of our devotional faith. But in Islam, it really is more success. That is, learning to live God's way in everything leads to success in this life for the Muslim, and for contentment and prosperity and peace, not only now, but in the next life as well, if Allah is merciful, although that is never certain. Islam is not a religion where weakness or suffering are in any sense valued as important parts of discipleship as they are within Christianity. It's a religion of growth and success, of honour, not shame, of glory, not defeat. Now, if we meld these different characteristics together, that humans are weak and ignorant and need guidance, that the final guidance has been provided through Muhammad, and that this should be for every aspect of our lives, then you see how the idea of jihad, or struggle, comes to be very important within Islam. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Jihad means struggle. That is, the devoted Muslim is committed to struggle, to push back weakness and ignorance in his own life and in the life of his family and in the life of his wider community and in the life of the whole society, should that be possible. This may take place through teaching and through discipline, through attendance at prayers, through attendance at the mosque, through personal conversation. But it may also take place through political struggle and through military conquest. This is important to understand, that for many devout Muslims, jihad remains largely personal and spiritual. Certainly for many devout Muslims living here in the West, this is what it would mean day by day. There's no realistic prospect of the struggle for a submission to Allah spreading very much beyond the Muslim community in this culture, for example. And many have in fact come to the West precisely because they value the political freedoms of Western society. But others emphasise that the political or military nature of jihad is important, and as they do so, they're not betraying Islam or misrepresenting it. It is, after all, how Islam spread for 1,000 years. Islam started as a small religious community in the town of Medina in what is now Saudi Arabia, but by the 17th century, 1,000 years later, it was dominant not only in the entire Arabian Peninsula, not just in Persia and North Africa, but in Western and Central Asia and across a good part of Southern Europe. We often fail to realise just how massive the Muslim empire was. And this incredible growth and domination didn't come through conversation and dialogue. It didn't come through evangelisation and persuasion. It came at the point of the sword. It came through conquest. That's simply historically what happened. In this sense, Islam has always historically been an expansionist, militant religion, a religion in which the tools of state and the tools of war are at times part of the arsenal. And for a millennium, it was indeed the religion of success and victory, of unparalleled and unstopped growth, not only in lands and in size and in wealth, but in sophistication and culture and even scientific discovery. But in the last 300 years, not so much. Islam has experienced a slow, dramatic and seemingly inexorable decline in the last 3 centuries and more, politically, economically, and in prosperity and in technology. The explosion of the West, of industrialisation and technological advancement, has been mirrored by a decline of influence and success in the Islamic world, and this is an obvious cause for anguish, and has been a cause of anguish and soul-searching for Muslims all over the world, and especially in the Islamic world. How does one respond to this decline, to the shrinking of its borders, to its domination by the West? How does a Muslim living in one of these Western countries, as many Muslims do, how does one react? And how does one deal with the dominance of the West? Or what about in those countries that are Islamic in their constitution or their government, but seem very significantly influenced by and affected by Western technology and culture? Well, in many ways that brings us to the diversity of Islam, to the diversity. When we consider how we might talk about Islam, we have to realise that it's probably unfair and inaccurate to say that there is only one thing called Islam. And we should understand this as Christians, friends. We should understand this. When we think about Christendom and its astonishing diversity around the world down through history, we would never assume that when someone says to us, we bump into in the street, that they are Christian, that they necessarily mean the same thing by it as we do. Would you assume that? I certainly wouldn't. And Islam is just as broad a church. And let me try to give you some flavour of just how broad it is. And apologies again in advance for some simplification here and some generalisation. Now, many of us have heard that there are Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, and it's true, this is perhaps the major divide within Islam. It goes back to disputes in the 7th century about who were the legitimate successors of Muhammad, and in some ways, if you want to wrap our heads around it, it's a little bit like the divide between Catholics and Protestants historically in Christianity. That is, there are some profound essentials in common, but also deeply and keenly felt differences that go to the heart of the practice and belief of the religion. Now, the large majority of Muslims in the world are Sunni, the large majority. There's also a mystical stream within Islam. We might even say they're kind of like the Muslim charismatics, and they're called the Sufis. And just to confuse things further, Sufis can be either Sunni or Shia, or they can be neither. Now, so there are already some major streams that any particular Muslim you might meet will fit within. However, within these broad streams, there are also substreams, because Islam is a legislative religion, remember, rather than a theological one. The key issue is not who God is or what he is like. The key issue is, what must I do? What is God's will for me in this situation? And over the centuries, there have arisen a number of different schools of Islamic law that come to their decisions about what is proper and right to do in different ways. And this leads to different schools of Islamic jurisprudence that different Muslims around the world will align themselves with. And so within the Sunni and the Shia, there are these different streams. But of course, there are also differences in commitment, as there are within Christianity. There are those who are radically and completely committed to their particular stream. There are those who are conservative, orthodox, committed, but perhaps not radical. There are moderates who are a bit less committed, but a bit committed. There are progressives, just like there are liberal Christians who wish to update and change Islam radically in that direction. And of course, there's a huge number of nominal Muslims around the world who bear the name of Islam, but who don't really practice very much of it. And we can make exactly the same kind of matrix for Christianity, could we not? In terms of level of commitment and the kind of different people we would meet. But we also need to, if that is not representing enough different boxes in which a particular Muslim might fit who you run into, there's another dimension of the matrix that we need to introduce, and that is regional and cultural differences. Because as Islam has spread about the world, it's taken on the characteristics of the local cultures that it's encountered. Because across Africa and Asia, for example, the mystical stream of Islam often merges with the local beliefs and superstitions of those cultures to form a kind of folk Islam. This is extremely large, right through Africa and indeed through Asia. And it looks very, very different from, say, a conservative Wahhabi Sunni Muslim in Saudi Arabia, or a young progressive Shia Muslim who has just migrated to Australia from Iran. Islam is massively diverse, and any Muslim you meet might be anywhere on this matrix. There's certainly plenty of diversity here in Sydney. Around 3.5% of Sydney's population is Islamic, and that's around 150,000 people or so. And as in Islam worldwide, the majority of Sydney Muslims are Sunnis. The two largest cultural or regional groupings are the Lebanese Sunni Muslims, who, geographically speaking, in Sydney cluster around Lakemba and its surrounding suburbs. But the Turkish Sunni Muslims are a growing percentage within Sydney's Muslim community, and they tend to, they're often concentrated in areas around Auburn and further west in Prestons. In Sydney, we have Shia Muslims, often in the St George area where there is a Shia mosque. But I just want to emphasise, Muslims come to Australia from all over the world. And an African or an Asian Muslim who you run into will very likely be very different from a Lebanese Sunni Muslim who you might be running into as well. There's massive variation. And this diversity helps us understand where radical or militant Islam has come from and how it fits into the picture. We've become used to hearing the names over the last 20 years or so, haven't we? Names like Al-Shabaab and the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, Jamaat Islamiyah, the Taliban, Al-Nusra Front, Hezbollah, Hamas, and of course more recently Islamic State. These groups didn't come from nowhere. They all claim a place within Islam, and they have their roots in the Islamic reform movements that emerged in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. Movements that emerged as Muslims sought to deal with the crushing reality of Islamic decline right across the Muslim world. Now, some people dealt with that decline by suggesting that Islam needed to modernise, to update, to make its peace with the West, to liberalise. But of course, quite a number of others took quite the opposite view, that the problem was that Islam had compromised and backslidden from its pure and original form, that the reason for its decline was its faithlessness to the vision of Muhammad and the Quran, and that if Islam was again to be strong and the growing malign influence of the West was to be pushed out of Islamic lands, then Islam needed to return to its pure and true form. Now, these reform movements, like Wahhabism and Salafism, have been fuelled, quite literally fuelled, of course, by the growth of Gulf state oil and the tremendous wealth that has come to that part of the world. and they've come to be very visible and influential right across the world of Islam. The most radical of these reform movements have come to believe in recent times that the extraordinary situation they find themselves in, with Western power infiltrating and even dominating the House of Islam, requires a more drastic response, a response of armed guerrilla-style warfare. They've come to the conclusion that this is the only avenue open to them to drive Western influence out of the territories of Islam and to overthrow corrupt Muslim governments. They're committed to warfare in whatever way they can against the West, and in particular, of course, against the United States and Israel. Now, none of this is to say that the militaristic and terroristic violence of some forms of radical Islam is only the result of their particular version of Islamic belief. That was a complicated sentence, wasn't it? But what I was trying to say was that there are a mass of political and cultural and economic factors that also play into the picture. There is anger at Western foreign policy. There is a sense of economic alienation and impoverishment. All of these are important factors, and Western commentators are right to point them out. This does help us to understand ISIS and where it's coming from, and Al-Shabaab and the Taliban. But it's not the full picture, because there is no question that they are Muslims and are acting as Muslims, and that a reformist, radically conservative style of Islam is right at the centre of their motivations. They are the direct descendants of those Islamic fundamentalist reform movements. And the fact that ISIS has declared a new caliphate is particularly important in this regard. ISIS wishes to restore and grow a true Islamic state. That is their goal, very clearly stated and articulated, in which Allah's will is truly done once and for all, and in which a leader or caliph rightly guides and rules the people. And in seeking to build such a state, they are really only doing what the very conservative Shia clerics of Iran have also been doing over the past 20, 30 years. And in doing so, they are one group in a very broad church, that is Islam. There's no reason, it seems to me, to deny any of this or pretend that it doesn't exist. There's no reason to tell Islamic State, as if we are in a position to tell them so, that they are in fact not Islamic, even when their own well-supported and coherent statements say that they are. President Obama isn't in any position to make that judgment, it seems to me, and neither are you and neither am I. Secular humanists, it seems to me, often act as if there are only two kinds of Muslims in the world. Their kind, which is the peaceful, tolerant Western Muslim, who's happy to keep their religion quiet, private, and only in the lounge room. The kind of Muslim, in other words, that a secular humanist would be if he or she were a Muslim. There's only that kind of Muslim, or the mad lunatic terrorist, the false Muslims of ISIS. It seems as if admitting that radical groups are motivated by their own particular stream of Islam somehow impugns all Muslims. But there's no reason for this to be the case. There are many, many streams and many groupings within Islam, and they themselves have different reactions to ISIS and to the terroristic violence. Some Muslims are broadly sympathetic with it, even if they wouldn't go quite so far themselves. Others share the grievances expressed by ISIS and Al-Qaeda, even if they wouldn't react in exactly the same way. But other Muslims are staunchly critical of ISIS and of their approach to jihad and to war. But even there are differences and variations in why they're critical and how they're critical. I simply wish to point out that the complexity and diversity of Islam and the complexity of this relationship to radical Islam should help us talk about Islam, whether with our secular humanist friends or our Muslim friends, and that's what I want to get to now as I conclude. How do we talk about this diverse beast that is Islam with Muslims and with secular humanists? I firstly want to say how not to. I want to suggest that it's quite pointless to join in or encourage debate about whether Islam should or should not be linked to or blamed for the actions of Islamic terrorists. I don't think this is the way to talk about Islam at all. It's pointless because Islam is so large and diverse, and ISIS and some radical Islamic groups represent just one stream of a particularly radical form of Islam. They don't speak for all Muslims, And neither, of course, does the Muslim you happen to be speaking to. Who is to decide who is the genuine faithful Muslim and who is not? I'm certainly not qualified to make that judgment, and quite frankly, neither is President Obama. It's also pointless because what would we be seeking to prove by such a discussion or such an argument? Are we trying to say that Islam is in some form damaged or rendered illegitimate if some of its members do bad things? Are we trying to score a point for the superiority of our position or our religion by taking down Islam in the religious PR stakes just a peg? Are we trying to show that because Islam in some circumstances leads to or is associated with bad outcomes, then it is less legitimate or less worthy of consideration? Like all utilitarian arguments, that is, arguments that look to the consequence for the validity of the argument, in the end you get into a stalemate, trade statistics with each other and tell anecdotes. I find it hard to see any positive outcome for arguments about the extent to which Islam should be linked with the actions of ISIS or any other terrorist group, either in discussions with Muslims themselves or with secular humanists. And especially it's the case, I think, in discussions with Muslim friends, because they are likely to be offended or conflicted or alarmed by such a conversation. Are you trying to pin something on me, they might think? Or are you simply seeking to attack the honour of Islam and the Prophet, which is a sure recipe for indignation and offence to any Muslim? Then how should we talk, if not in this rather pointless debate about who is to blame? Well, brothers and sisters, I speak tonight as a Christian. I speak to a room, I think, largely of Christians. We have to speak as Christians. It's the only way for us to speak. There is no neutral place for us to speak from. The secular humanist, of course, will pretend that there is a neutral place. He will pretend that it's his place as the spectator and observer of all reality and of all phenomena such as religions. But secular humanists have their own ideology and belief system, and we can't pretend to join them as neutral observers and participate in a discussion on their ground rules, as if we can assess religion as a disinterested spectator or observer. We can only speak as Christians from the basis of what we know to be true from the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. Or to put it in the words of the Apostle Paul, whatever we do in word or deed, we must do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Whenever we speak, we should speak of Christ. We should speak about Christ. We should speak on the basis of Christ. We should speak in the name of Christ. And just a few verses later, Paul gives an example of what that means for the Colossians he was writing to. It means they should walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time, letting their speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that they could know how to answer each person. As we walk in wisdom towards those outside, to those who themselves are not Christians, we live a life based on a knowledge of how the world really is as created by God in Christ, and we make the best use of the time that God has given us as the world heads to its end. And so we have conversations that are gracious, that are generous and kind and loving, that have the benefit of the other person in mind, not our own. We have conversations that seek the advantage of the person we are speaking with and not the winning of an argument. And we season our conversations with salt. And whatever salt represents in this passage, the general idea is clear enough. We season our conversations with challenge and with interest and with the truth, which of course is part of being gracious, isn't it? It's the ultimate failure of love or grace to withhold the truth from somebody and to not speak the truth when we possess it. As Christians, we follow a Lord who was full of grace and truth, and the conversations we have with our friends, whether with our Muslim friends or our secular humanist friends, we have those conversations as grace and truth people. And this is the great contribution we have to make to every conversation, whether with our friends or neighbours or in the letters page of the Sydney Morning Herald, to speak graciously out of love with generosity of spirit, but never to speak less than the truth, which of course is focused on and fulfilled in Christ. This gracious answer seasoned with gospel truth will equip us, Paul says, to answer every person that we meet, We will listen to each one, we'll understand where each one is coming from, what particular stream they're in, what their own experience and history is. And yet our answers will always be seasoned with one key ingredient, and that is the name of Christ. What does that mean for our secular humanist friends and our conversations with them? As I've already said, there's no point in getting into a discussion about the degree to which ISIS is legitimately Islamic or not. It's a fruitless talk. Perhaps we can just agree with our secular humanist friends that the situation is very complex, that the radicals do legitimately claim to be Islamic, and that Islam is very diverse. But we might say to our friend that although the vast majority of Muslims here in Australia would not share these awful violent tendencies, a great many of them would share the wish of every devout Muslim, and that is to see more and more people everywhere, including you and including me, to submit to the true and final guidance of God in the Quran. Perhaps we should respect Muslims enough to take that claim seriously and to engage with it seriously, we could say to our secular humanist friend. Perhaps we should come to the really important question, and that is Islam true? Not should it be blamed or absolved, but should it be followed? Should it be joined, or should it be repudiated as incorrect or untrustworthy? If Islam is trustworthy and true in its guidance, the only honest thing to do is to join it, if it represents the will of the God who made everything. But if it doesn't represent the will of God who made everything, then we must not only not join it, but urge Muslims to leave it for their good, because no benefit ever accrued from believing something that is not true. Now, this will make your secular humanist friend uncomfortable, of course, because you've transgressed into the forbidden area. You've started to talk as if there is a staircase. You've started to talk as if there's a way of assessing whether some religions may be true and some religions may not. And this is where our contributions as Christians are most distinctive and most helpful, because the life, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is not only the point on which Christianity stands or falls, it's also the point upon which secular humanism stands or falls, and Islam stands or falls. If, as a matter of historical truth, the death and resurrection of Jesus did happen, and this is something, of course, that can be investigated and looked into, then secular humanism has made a profound mistake, because the staircase between upstairs and downstairs has been there all the time, and the staircase's name, of course, is Jesus Christ. If Jesus really did rise from the grave as an atonement for the sins of the world, then Islam too cannot be the revelation of divine guidance that it claims to be, because the Quran teaches quite explicitly that Jesus did not die, that he did not rise from death, and that he did not and could not and need not atone for the sins of the world. If Jesus really did die and rise for the sins of the world, then the claims of Islam cannot be true. And of course the reverse is true, we must point out. If Jesus did not die, if he did not rise, then as the Apostle Paul says so sharply, then Christianity too is empty and pointless, and we're more to be pitied than all. The death and resurrection of Jesus, I want to suggest, is the conversation starter that opens up these multiple streams, both with our secular humanist friends and with our Muslim friends. Because with our Muslim friends, we can invite them to look into the Jesus who they hold in great honour, and into the Gospels that they regard as revelation. Even so, most Muslims have never read a Gospel or grappled with its contents. And one of the best places to start any gracious, thoughtful, generous, loving conversation with a Muslim friend is with a mutual reading of one of the Gospels that we both agree are revelations. The Gospels, of course, all move inexorably to the cross as the key to who Christ is and what he came to do. And as we listen with grace to our Muslim friends' views, to his explanations of who Jesus is and to how he fits within the revelation of the Quran, we may find that we don't convince our Islamic friend of the truth of Christ, or we may. But what we will have done is made the vital contribution, the contribution that only we can make as Christians, to open up what the Gospels really say about Jesus, and in so doing, highlight the most basic and key differences between Islam and Christian belief. with our Muslim friends as with our secular friends, let me suggest that our talk should be framed around Christ, around his character, and around the glories of who he is and what he has done. Well, my time is rapidly ending. In fact, it's 5 minutes over. Sorry about that, Andrew. Let me come to the ethics of talk, because we've spoken tonight about how we might talk about Islam, and as we've done so, I hope we've seen that this is also how we should talk about everything. The ethics of all Christian talk focuses on Jesus Christ, not only in its manner, but in its content, in its assumptions, and in its emphasis. Our conversations with others should love other people, as the disciples of Jesus are committed to do. And we should care enough about the people we mix with and interact with every day to walk across the room and to engage them in wise, gracious, salty, truthful conversation. This, of course, is the kind of conversation that Jesus had so often, where he was unfailingly patient and gentle, but at the same time, motivated by love, was willing to get past generalities and past surface talk and get down to the issues that are the difference between life and death. Thank you.